I think there's just a different incentive structure that even if you have players like an OpenAI with embedded search, it's still like a black box experience. So there's still a lot of room for how do you create something that's actually the best experience for developers possible. And oftentimes that requires more flexibility and malleability. And I think that's what we focus on versus some of these players that are more consumer facing.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of AI Without Borders. I'm thrilled to have Thais Castello, former founder of Creio and founding team at EXA, where she currently serves as head of marketing and strategy. EXA is building a search engine for agents that has raised over 20 million from funds like Lightspeed, but most importantly for this podcast, Thais is originally from Brazil. Thais, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. Super excited.
So starting with your background, before joining EXA, you were founder of Creio. Can you share what the company did? And from the likely long list of lessons from that experience, what do you say is the main lesson that you bring that maybe if you're going to build a future company, you would do differently?
Absolutely. So basically, I started Creio with one of my best friends in Brazil, and the whole idea was faith is one of the biggest pillars in people's lives, especially in Latin America. And it hadn't really migrated to the digital world, right? So the idea was, how do we create a platform for faith content where, consumers and people can use it as their guide in their faith journey? But instead of it being a pure like B2C play where we would like a Hello or a Glorify or a Headspace, let's say, charge a subscription for content, we wanted to make the platform completely free and actually distribute it almost in a B2B way via the creators and basically become the platform where they can house all of their content, manage their community, and kind of process donations, right? Donations are a huge part of what keeps them going. And there's over like 9 billion in donations a year, all in cash. So if you can migrate also and make that a much easier process for people, it benefits everyone. So that was the premise. A lot of learnings. I would say, if I could change one thing, it would probably be to test a little bit more of the distribution / monetization strategy since early on. I think we were super confident on faith being a pillar that, requires a lot of innovation and where there is a need gap in the market. And we were also very confident on people having this deep connection with their specific community or their specific creators that they follow. And I think that was true. But how does that translate into actually finding the best channels for growth and find ways to grow organically? And I think we almost like too strongly bet on the fact that these creators would be able to distribute on our behalf, but it's very hard to get them to adopt technology. So I think if I could go back, I'd probably test a bit more in the beginning, trying more direct to consumer routes or pairing those two. So yeah, I think people talk a lot about product market fit, but realistically you need the product to have PMF, but also this like distribution market fit and pricing market fit, let's put it that way. So lots of factors there.
When you have a business that requires changing people's habits in a way, obviously that becomes more complex. I had a similar situation early on. You were part of the founding team at EXA, joining when if I'm not mistaken, the team was smaller than 10 people. For those that aren't familiar, can you share a brief description of what EXA does?
Of course. So EXA, basically, we are building the first search engine for AIs. So, Google obviously is an incredible search over the web that kind of organizes the information for consumers. And in a world now in which AI agents are taking over, our whole thesis is AI agents will be searching the web more than humans. So how do we create the best search engine for an AI agent to search? So there's a few things that go into that. So basically you kind of need to actually create the first search that can understand meaning and not just search based on keywords like traditional search engines like Bing and Google do, but that can actually understand the query and the meaning behind what you're asking and behind all of the websites and do that matching in a much more accurate way. So not only are we the first search engine for AIs, but also the first that has this like meaning-based search powering it.
And one of the things we've been seeing maybe in the last 2 years is the foundational model players like OpenAI have been adding web search capabilities. Why do you still believe, and EXA believes, that there's still an opportunity for an external player and like to get to offer like this web searching capabilities for agents that maybe foundational model companies are not as well positioned to do?
For sure. A lot of people ask us this. We get this question a lot of like, oh, why wouldn't Google do this? Or why wouldn't OpenAI do this? And I think at the end of the day, it's all about incentives. Like even a company like OpenAI, the majority of their revenue is consumer, right?
Hmm?
Same with Google, right? Google is like a consumer company selling ads. So they're much more optimized in how to perfect this experience for consumers versus EXA, like we're purely B2B. We're focused on like serving this for businesses or for companies that have their own AI products. So I think there's just a different incentive structure that even if you have players like an OpenAI with embedded search, it's still like a black box experience that developers can't fully control or customize for their solution. So there's still a lot of room for how do you create something that's actually the best experience for developers possible. And oftentimes that requires more flexibility and malleability for whatever solution they're building and product they're building. And I think that's what we focus on versus some of these players that are more consumer facing, let's say.
No, and I find this fascinating, especially in this area that you're speaking about control. As I was thinking about search, I maybe divided in like, or the process in two parts, and correct me if I'm saying something wrong there. There's kind of that filtering part, which is like what results match the query. That should be relatively objective. But there may be also kind of a separate part on the ranking that may have like a subjective portion, like a user may prefer certain sources or certain like type of information. As you think about giving the user more control in how you're building, how do you think about those controlling knobs to also account for like the factuals portion, but also for the preference portion?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think so far we focus this controllability more on almost settings within the search. So think like, does the person want just the links? Do they want the links and all the content within those pages? Or do they want snippets within those pages? Do they want to crawl the entire website and find subpages within it? Do they want to eliminate certain domains or only search over certain domains? Do they want to filter a specific category of data? So for example, some customers only want to search over companies or only want to search over news or only want to search over people. And so it's how do you offer this choice, right? And allow them to make these trade-offs. And I think the beauty of a search that is embedding based and kind of a newer based search like EXA is you can do these cuts in a more malleable way. So for example, even these categories that I talked about of data, realistically, it's not cut and clear in the real world, right? Like how do you know if a website or a link counts as like a company website? And it requires a lot of this embedding based search logic for us to be able to categorize these vectors, let's say, and search only in that specific subsegment. And a customer could come and be like, oh, I only want to search over technical PDFs. So you need this logic of semantic search to be able to offer that flexibility. But so far, we're not doing, I think, what you were maybe alluding to, which is this customization in the ranking. The ranking is still the how we, let's say, present the results and define which results are more relevant. It's still consistent across, but there is a world in the future in which that might make sense for certain customers. But so far, we focus more the customization on the parameters and less so in the ranking of results.
I think makes total sense to start on that parameter direction. I was reading, and one of the things that EXA built from the beginning was building its own index, training its own model, creating its own database. So things that were hard, and obviously imagine it took time and resources. But can you share why this is important, what advantages it has?
We took a big bet on this. We spent millions of dollars on a cluster. We've been hiring ML researchers since the very early days of the company. The first 2 years of the company were really just training models. And I think the beauty of that is we own our full stack. So we own the model, we own the vector database, we optimize every single part of that flow. And this allows us to then do things that if you're a wrapper and you're just wrapping players like Google or Bing, you can't do. So for example, we introduced a couple of weeks ago a fast version of our API, meaning like a super low latency that's like the fastest in market. And if you have to ping third parties to run these searches kind of on your behalf and you're just wrapping them, there's no way that you can optimize that speed beyond a certain point because you are relying on other people's settings, let's say, and you can't be making those trade-offs. Versus like in our case, because we own that full stack, we can optimize every single little piece in the flow, make slight trade-offs where necessary, and deliver an outcome that's different. Or a different example, we've been having a big surge in like finance use cases or government or consulting. And these types of companies require a lot of privacy and zero data retention. So we can do agreements with these players on like, oh, we don't retain any queries. And again, if you're wrapping a third party, you by definition are sending those queries out into someone else and you can't offer that same level of privacy. So it's interesting because a lot of these things are not ones that we necessarily anticipated when we were training our model and building our search. We were doing that in order to build the best search engine and to build like, okay, how do we push the boundaries on what search could be? But there's a lot of like unintended positive consequences of then these different features that now we can offer, and that if we had chosen the easier route of just wrapping someone else, we wouldn't be able to now offer.
What do you say are some of the recommendations you give to the user now to get the best results at EXA?
The way that we even describe our products is we have an array of different solutions that span from very low latency, low compute, meant to be a very fast search that can be high volume. And that's our search API that you can plug into any product. And it solves, let's say, those queries that are maybe a little bit simpler. And then on the other way of the spectrum, you have something that's like high compute, high latency, so it takes longer. It is more expensive, but it can solve very, very complicated queries that are super valuable. So that's Websets, the Websets API. And in between, then you have like our research endpoint, the answer endpoint that can kind of flex in that compute spectrum, let's say. So I think it all depends on kind of what is your use case and what are you trying to optimize for and how valuable is that query to you. So we have, for example, some customers that are pulling full market analyses, meaning like full like data sets of what is every single competitor in a space that I need to know about. Solving that query is worth thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So like if you have to wait a minute for it and you have to spend 10 cents on a result, like that's fine. You're willing to pay for that, you know? If you need something fast, that's going to be super high volume and empowering millions of users within an app. Obviously, that's not feasible. And you need that like low latency experience. So then you can flex and use the search API with the right parameters and all of that to make it like the fastest thing possible. So I think our job is much more, how do we offer this range of solutions and then help you figure out what is the best setting / endpoint for exactly what you're building. But I think in general, what I would think about is it requires a retraining of almost what is possible with search, right? In the same way that now consumers are having to retrain themselves on how they used to prompt with Google versus how they can prompt with ChatGPT. It's a similar thing. Like there are things that you could not solve with Google search or with LinkedIn search or whatever, that now you can with EXA. So for example, a website's query. So if you want to find every single software engineer in the US that is Latino and that has backend experience and has more than 10 GitHub stars, you can solve that query. And like, you wouldn't even think of asking Google that because it's so clear in your mind. You've been so trained that Google cannot solve that. So I think that's kind of my biggest piece of advice, is actually understanding like, what are all the use cases that you can build with search? Like search is not just this like the obvious thing you've been thinking about, right? We have customers using it for data enrichment, for powering like companion apps, for live citations. There's like a million use cases. And then what is kind of the trade-off you're willing to do when it comes to like cost, compute, and time to make that happen? So
no, I think that's a great decision framework and see it across the board and understanding what matters for your application. And as you were saying, that varies between, there is not one fits all solution there. We've been mentioning Websets a little bit now, and it's a product that has so far a huge success at EXA. And I know you were the creator of it inside. Can you share about what was that discovery process? What was the insight that led to the creation of Websets and a bit of that launching experience?
Yeah, for sure. It was really interesting because Websets came about, I think, because of two insights. So first, our search API was already out in the world. We had multiple customers using it. And we started seeing a trend of customers using it for internal use cases, meaning we expected them to kind of plug in the API into their products, into their end products that they're selling to customers. But we saw them using it internally for things like sales, recruiting, investing, like finding things on the web that were valuable to them. And we were like, this is interesting. And then at the same time, I think from an engineering side, we had someone that was thinking of the question of what would a high compute search look like? Different than keyword search, where there is no such concept as high compute. With something like EXA, high compute actually does make sense. Like you can put more compute into a query to solve it. So there was almost like a technology question at the same time of what would this like best search look like? And we ended up doing like a whole discovery process on talking to like dozens of users on what are they using for sales? What are they using for recruiting? What are they using for investing? What tools do they love? What tools do they hate? What pieces of their workflows are still very broken? And the message that kept coming back is sure, maybe actually have a decent enough tool like, I don't know, Clay, to run my workflows. But the search part is still really broken. Like I hate LinkedIn Sales Navigator, or ChatGPT doesn't work, or I try Googling things and I know they exist, but I can't find them. So we were like, okay, let's basically focus on solving the search component, which is our bread and butter. It's what we do really well. And understanding that people are always looking for like lists. They want to find a list of things that qualify in a specific set of criteria. Rather, you're like looking for a candidate to recruit, or if you're an investor looking to invest in a founder, or if you want to sell into a specific segment, right? So that theme was recurrent of how do I find a list of things that matches exactly what I want in a very precise, verified way. So that's kind of how websites came about. And then it was a whole process. Honestly, like it took a village on building the product. So what was cool was we actually we announced it out into the world and got like a huge wait list of people that were super excited to use it. So it gave us the chance to actually roll it out a little bit slowly after that and test it out and iterate on the product very, very quickly. So we actually had a group of engineers that all flew to Hong Kong, and we're living like in Hong Kong together, basically in an apartment, coding websites all day and kind of live iterating on the feedback that we would receive from these like beta users. So then we like got it to a point where we felt really good about actually blasting it out into the world out there. And that happened earlier this year. And honestly, it was like an amazing, I think, reaction that we got. And obviously still a lot that we can do and to optimize.
And as you think about the evolution even of websites, maybe call it websites 2.0, how do you think about the temptation of starting going deeper in the application layer?
It's a great question. We had a lot of discussions. But what I'll say is, I think we are fundamentally, our edge is in being a technology company. We are a search company, right? So I think our edge will always be data and will always be search. There's some elements of workflow that make sense for us to creep into slightly, but we don't want to get into a place where we're, having to compete for like workflow software. Like that's not the goal. Like it's much more like, how do we make sure that users can connect this very valuable data that they find with EXA into whatever workflow they use in a very seamless way. So rather that's integrations or native integrations actually within their products already, and all these things. But I don't think we want to distract ourselves from our core capabilities right now, at least, on becoming this like workflow product versus like a search product. So I view it much more as like, how can we add more data sources? How can we search over different unique types of data, not just publicly available web data, and kind of become the best data aggregator that can search in the most like high compute intelligent way over that versus how do we become the most complete workflow that you can integrate and send emails and build all these different crazy things. I think we're better off as a company focusing on that search part.
Yeah, which I find the challenge today, and not just for EXA, but for many companies. And there's a temptation of doing everything, but obviously there you have to focus on like, what do you do
A lot.
very well. And one of the things that EXA has is that it has like kind of two components. You have kind of the developer-led motion, which is how I came across the platform when I was building the memo generator. And but also from what you're sharing have an enterprise approach. I've seen many startups fail to successfully leverage the best of both worlds. How has it been the journey for you at EXA, and what have you find working in mixing those two motions?
So I think the developer approach has been our bread and butter, like since the early days. And I give lots of credit to our founders for, I think, putting so much effort into that and being so intentional with that since early on. And it goes from things like being super present on Twitter, having amazing docs, moving really quickly on things like MCPs when that became a thing. So it's super important because I think you develop trust and you develop also interest, right? I think a lot of the moat of our company is in being able to hire amazing people, which also this like developer presence makes a huge difference for. But also two, it's like we want to position ourselves as like, we're doing something different. We're building something truly like a foundational technology. We're not a wrapper company. Like we're doing research, like we're a research lab. And for that, you need to win that developer trust, and that takes time, and it takes actually technical depth, right? So I think that is like the healthy foundation that is necessary. I agree with you that many companies kind of stop there. And then how do you move upstream from there, I think is very hard. And I think our work over the last year has really been in how do we make that movement upstream. So a lot of that has been in how do we attract the attention of enterprises? How do we cement trust? So things like even like SOC 2, having an amazing sales process, hand-holding them, publishing articles, publishing research, going to conferences, talking one-on-one with so many people, doing events, like all of these like very high touch methods and getting in front of the right people was, I think, a lot of the challenge. And I think it was a combination of marketing and sales in how we kind of like build that motion. And now probably like 5%, let's say, of our revenue is enterprise. So I think we've definitely like succeeded in balancing out those two things, but still we protect this developer first mindset a lot in a very intentional way. Like we never want to just feel like we're appealing to enterprises and forget this developer core, because I think that's what keeps it healthy and what allows us to grow in a very organic way. Like we're still probably 95% inbound. And the outbound that we do is just like very intentional and very targeted to customers that we know would be amazing for EXA. And we're like, why are they not reaching out? So we might as well. But I think we've had the benefit of building this very healthy foundation that allows us to then lean on inbound and to leave outbound for things that are very specific.
I was seeing you're a very creative person, and I think you ran a sprint in the past couple of months where you ran like different experiments. I saw the Billboards. I saw that you did like a massive box game that couldn't fit in elevators that I was reading about, and but that it got the results. You were sharing there that you 10x the signups. Can you share what have you learned from that experimentation that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I think in the startup world in general, I think there's two things, right? It's like, how do you cut through the noise? So how do you gain a disproportionate mind share, right? Because you're much smaller than incumbents, so you need to find a way to cut through the noise and kind of call more attention than almost you deserve at that stage. That's one. And then second is, how do you do that in a way that also builds trust? I think there are some startups that take the approach of just calling the attention and not worrying so much about building trust. But I think for a product like ours, that's so foundational and it's infrastructure, right? Like, and it's so deeply technical. Like we need to also be able to convey that trust. So I think we've tried to do two things. We've tried to like, how do we build a machine on channels that we know that work great for us? So things like organic content, SEO, email outbound, etc. And then pair that with more of these high touch activities that help to build trust. Like billboards are a good example, events, the boxes activation. And there are things that sometimes feel not scalable, and that's true, they're not, but they help to kind of bring this brand love and brand trust that just tactics that are scalable can't do on their own. So we've always liked to pair both of those and do things in a very different, unique way as well. So I think we've always prided ourselves in being, I don't know if the word is contrarian, but in being unconventional, I think, with go-to-market and marketing as a whole, and trying to take approaches that not everyone is doing. And I think that pays off in getting that disproportionate amount of attention. The boxes was a good example. Like it's something that makes no rational sense to do. And no one has done it before because it makes no sense, but that it has the ability to cut through the noise and it brings results, right? So like we generated probably over nearly 1 million in pipeline from that activity, in either like warming up customers that were cold or bringing in new customers that we were excited about. So it has that effect.
Yeah, and also it's the thing that people remember. There is a very famous Colombian startup called Rappi, and I think a very high percentage of the people in my network still remembers back 2016, 2015, the founders like giving up donuts. It was a non-scalable thing, but it's sticking people's mind.
Yeah. No, the amount of people that have told me about this like boxes video that obviously like we only deliver the box to 50 people, right? To 50 companies, but we got so many messages about it. Or the billboard, same thing. Like even people in New York that didn't even see it in person, but saw it on Twitter and loved them and messaged us about it. So it's also, I think, how do you, yes, create these unscalable things, but then allow them to ripple through in ways that go beyond that activation. I think the ability to also create content off of those things and post on socials and share, etc., is super important to amplify the effects. Let's put it that way. So another cool example was last year we're focusing a lot on hiring. So bringing in top AI, ML researchers, engineers. So I actually spent a ton of my time on recruiting, and I went to all of the AI conferences like NeurIPS, ACL. We flew to Thailand, we flew to Canada, like we hit all of them. And at NeurIPS, which is one of the biggest ones, we created basically an app that embedded all of the papers from the conference, and it would allow anyone to see this really cool visualization map of all of the papers and how they would show up in like a vector space, but also allow anyone to search in a very like neural way to find the papers that would interest them. So, and that went like totally viral within the conference. And multiple people heard about us, not by looking at our booth, but by someone sending them the app. So even things that are digital have that like viral cut through the noise potential if done in the right way for the right audience.
And related to this theme, last week, as we were preparing for the podcast, you mentioned to me how you were the first non-engineer research person to join EXA. What do you say is one piece of advice that you wish someone had given you coming from the first non-technical person joining like this heavy engineer research oriented organization?
I can't take full credit for it. So we had Isabel and Vishal on the team that joined right before I did to kind of set up the sales side. So I was the first person on, let's say, the marketing side to join. But I think a lot of what we had to do is turn it from like a research technical, almost like project into a company, right? And it requires a lot of process setup, of mindset shift, of even like education internally of the team and how do we think about this. So for example, how do we shrink the distance between engineering and customers? How do we bring in a lot of the insights that we're hearing from these calls and allow it to like reprioritize our roadmap and have conversations about, okay, how do we reprioritize our roadmap based on these like needs that we're seeing that would bring money now versus things that we are super bullish on, but that are long-term things for research later. So it had to like shift the timeline of how we think as a company from this very long-term thinking thing to a balance of long-term and short-term. So I think that was like one of the big things. The second is I think learning how to speak this engineering language, which for me was a huge learning. Like I came from the application layer, I came from the consumer side as well. Engineers, both internally, but also as customers, are very different. I joke that like they're like cats. They don't like being marketed to, they don't like being sold to. It's different from like salespeople that love being sold to. So you have to just take a different approach. And I think with engineers, for example, it's a lot of how do you put out value into the world? So things like evals that are interesting to them, or reports or research papers that you publish, or applets that they can interact with, versus it being like announcing our new feature that does XYZ, right? So it's how do you create value and make them come to you as they become interested in you because you're creating unique things that are exciting to them. So I think that was a big shift, but it definitely took a lot of learning and of adapting it into even this like subtle language and the words to use and how to describe things and how to change copy to not be too salesy. So took a lot of learning for sure.
And this past month, adjacent to this space, there has been a significant controversy over the tweet by the Cloudflare founder about Perplexity bypassing the non-crawl preference. And beyond speaking about that specific case, I was curious to get your view on the whole paywall crawl model, and if you think that we are moving towards a more closed internet.
It's an interesting question. It's a very hard one, and I realistically don't know how, as an industry, it will be solved, because I obviously like I understand the problem from the perspective of publishers, right? At the same time, it's like they're running this math of how do we get the word out there, right? How do you even get platforms like ChatGPT, for example, to cite your site? And SEO is going to slowly give way to things like GEO. So you want to also allow for this access, let's put it that way. But at the same time, you don't want to lose out on the monetization of people actually clicking through and landing on your site. So it's a very hard conundrum, and I don't really know how the industry as a whole will solve this. But I think we'll have to find solutions one way or another. Like I don't think that a world of closed internet would be good for anyone realistically. So some solution will have to be found that balances out all those forces.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting time, and
yeah,
I imagine it's not like black or white. Like it's gonna end up being like an in between. And related to the geo as a marketing lead, any advice for other founders or marketing leaders on practical things that you can do to ensure that you rank high on these new search engines? I heard kind of the common ones around well-structured writing, being authoritative on a topic, but do you have other ones that maybe are not as common on the recommendations that you've seen, even as you run marketing at EXA work?
For those that are less familiar with GEO versus SEO, so it's kind of the field of how do you get cited by chat apps like ChatGPT and LLMs. So I think there's two things there to keep in mind that are important to understand. So one is, how do you make it into the model's memory, right? So how do you, and that there's less control because in a way there's certain cutoffs of when models were trained. So for example, I actually don't know on GPT-5, but until GPT-4, like there were a lot of companies that weren't mentioned because ChatGPT didn't know they existed because they were founded since the last cutoff date. So a lot is how do you set a healthy foundation of presence to make sure that you make it into the next, let's say, cutoff. That's one piece. But on the things that are happening live, what's interesting to understand is, for example, ChatGPT uses Bing as their search engine. For starters, probably in the past, you've never thought about how do you optimize for Bing ranking, right? But now it matters a lot. It's not just Google ranking that matters anymore. So how do you make it into those top 10? If you're not in those top 10, you're not even going to be considered, let's say, in the set for LLMs. But the second is understanding the logic of how these LLMs even do these searches. So basically the user puts a query in ChatGPT. ChatGPT would go and query then a platform like Bing to search, pull the content up of those top 10 results to then summarize that answer to the user and decide what to cite. So one of the biggest changes is instead of the query being something that a human is typing, it's an LLM typing that query. So instead of it being like short keywords, like instead of it being like company SF robotics, which is how a person would type, it would probably be a much longer query. So optimizing for things like long form keywords matters a lot more than they did in the past, because likely you'll have these longer descriptions that are going to be prompting Bing or Google to kind of find those sources. So optimizing for long form keywords is, I think, one super important thing for geo. I think you mentioned the piece on like super well structured text. The other thing that I keep hearing is a format of question and answer, because also in the way that the user frames it to the LLM, it's always usually like a question, and the LLM tends to then search for things that have that similar structure and where it's clear that they'll be able to get a snippet that answers that exact question when citing. So question and answer format is something else that I think will matter a lot. And this like Bing optimization versus just the pure Google optimization is, I think, something else that's super important to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I've been hearing the same on the fact section. And yeah, also the other parts start with companies knowing if they're even being like featured and what's their starting point and what they're working towards to. One of the parts that as a Latin American podcast that we have to speak is about the region. And you previously built a company in Latin America, and now you have had the opportunity to work closely with what I would describe as a very Bay Area founding team. Big difference that you find from like how people build companies in Latin America versus how people are building companies in the Bay Area, if any.
Oh, there's lots. I would say first, the dynamics of the market are so different. So I think Latin America, you still need to build things that are a bit broader, meaning the market itself is still not as large or as mature as the US. And so you can't go so niche and so specific with the creation. So I think you tend to see companies that are a bit broader in what they're tackling, not necessarily just purely horizontal, but just like a bit of a broader mandate versus here I've been mind blown by how specific theses can get. The second is, I think there's a bit of a difference in how close to the real economy they are. I still think in Latin America, you have a lot more, even within tech companies, they're a lot more adjacent to the real economy. So think like Motu, for example, that's a company that is so Latin America and like makes total sense for that market. And would not be like a Silicon Valley type company. And here you end up with a lot more of these very purist tech companies that are also often selling into tech versus in Latin America. It's almost like the tech market's not large enough for you to be able to create products that are purely selling into tech. So I think that the dynamics of the economy and how the market operates just lead to different theses being explored. And I think that one of the results of that and how people then go about building companies and even how investors, choose what to put money in is there's a little bit more of a risk aversion in Latin America than I think in Silicon Valley. Here, I think I see a lot of this mentality of go big or go home. The market's super liquid. You're trying to build things very fast in a very aggressive way. And in LatAm, money is less infinite oftentimes. So you also have to be more mindful of how to build and think of profitability since earlier on. Because there's not that many like liquidity exit opportunities for companies, et cetera. So you just have to be more adaptive to the reality of how the market operates. And so, yeah, I think you have to be forced to build a company that kind of stands on its own 2 feet since earlier on in its history than here.
No, I agree. Sadly, there's, I think, less risk capital in the region for more R&D heavy early investments. Hopefully that changes in the future. But jumping to the final part, I would love to do a quick fire round. I give you 3 questions and you give me your 3 quick reactions.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
What percentage reign of extra traffic is coming from agent/GEO versus traditional search?
Not enough yet. It's still lower than I'd want. I would say it's probably like in the single digits still.
Are you long or short on Google?
I am long on Google as a company. I am short on Google search as a destination in the way it is today.
Interesting. What are you optimizing for in life? I know some people like to leave legacy, other people it's achievement, other people it's competition. What do you say it's a thing that makes you wake up in bed every day and give your all?
That's a great question. I think for me, it's 2 things. So for me, it's a mix of achievement and ambition. I think I've always been a super ambitious person, and life is short. You only get one of it. So you might as well spend it doing something great and something big. So I've always liked to think very big. At the same time, I think I've always loved the idea of invention and innovation and truly creating something new. I'm not the type of person that wants to like optimize something that currently exists or just build on top of things that are already out in the world. I think I've always had this desire to create something new and kind of bring innovation and drive impact through that. So I think a mix of those 2.
No, Thais, I highly appreciate you taking the time to jump. This was been an amazing conversation.
Of course. No, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about Latin America and startups. So this has been great.